course. Well, thank you for framing that way as always. So, Darren Baccus at Farm Credit Canada. We are a Canadian Crown corporation that has had the pleasure of serving the Canadian food and ag industry for well over 5 decades. Our focus is on enhancing Canadian food and ag, which finds us touching every part of the Canadian agricultural value chain, starting, of course, with our farmers and ranchers, the stewards of the land, all the way up to, as we like to say, from farm to fork, if you will. And so, as we've talked about on other occasions, incredible opportunity to impact an industry that is so important to all of us, because as we know, tomorrow, knock on wood, we're going to be sleeping, we're going to be breathing, and of course, we're going to be eating. So my starting point whenever we talk about the financials of supporting transitions from conventional management practices to regenerative or sustainable management practices is I always like to cross out that word impact investors. And so we don't see the support of these type of transitions being exclusively in the investable universe of impact investors. Because when you look across other asset classes, I'll take real estate as an example. Institutional investors have long understood now that there is a development period. So there is a period where their capital has to undergo a different type of risk return spectrum as that project, if you will, as that building moves from greenfield to a hole in the ground to standing 27 stories above a city. When we think about the transition of a farm, very similar. So if I think about an orchard, regardless of conventional or regenerative management practices, we do need to think about the risk return of the development time of that orchard. So of course, the planting of the pecans or whatever it may be, versus the stabilized cash flowing piece of that. And so the starting point and the question, of course, was, what are the challenges? What were any surprises we saw? There was no surprises from how is a primary production operation going to transition. I'd say the surprise, the headwind, the challenge is translating that development period, that J curve, if you will, that period where we know that cash flow will reduce and costs will increase potentially, to get to a more enduringly resilient operation. How do we explain to the capital what that needs to look like, what that should look like, how they should underwrite it, and really what time horizon makes sense for them to put capital into that kind of J curve type investment? Which again, if I wrap that all together, very similar across, as I said, real estate. You see this in private equity. Certainly see this in venture, where there is that expectation of that J curve taking you to the horizon where things are cash flowing, more enduringly sustainable. Two words that come out of that question for us. One is system, and the other is translation. And let me unpack the two of them. So the first is the encouragement, both from a primary producer perspective, from a value add perspective in the food and ag system, to think about it as the system. What role do we play as we hand off the calories, as we bring in the labor to work and provide the value on a day-to-day basis? It's that system approach. And then as capital, also to think about investing into the system. It is a place in the system where capital will make their investment from a risk return perspective, but ultimately it is a system. So that's a key piece that we believe at Farm Credit Canada. We can assist in looking holistically where the opportunity is in the system and where the capital can go in the system. And then something that you and I have had the pleasure of talking about before, which is translation. Right? We are seeing more and more capital come into, well, I was going to say Canadian food and ag, but food and ag globally, where that capital may not have historically invested in food and ag. So they are very sophisticated from an investment perspective, from a financial structuring perspective, but they may need some translation to really understand the system of agriculture. And again, at Farm Credit Canada, we find ourselves asking each of the participants in food and ag and the newcomers from a capital to give each other grace, because there is deep sophistication from both of those parties, but it is relatively new where large institutional capital is coming towards food and ag and an investment. So again, systems thinking, which our friends at RFSI have been talking about for years, of course, and then translation, recognizing that new parties are continuing to come and sit at the table and want to talk about Canadian food and ag globally. So I'll start by saying I don't have a magic bullet. And there's been many people smarter than I with much more experience thinking about how to combine that capital policy procurement pieces together. But why I take both comfort but also encouragement is seeing the incremental steps moving ahead. And if I go back to the key part of your question there being what's the biggest structural breakdown, it won't surprise any of us. It is that adoption and it is that fatigue that we see from our primary producers. Because ultimately, it is our primary producers that bear that mental burden, economic burden of undertaking that transition from conventional to regenerative. And I remind myself, and the team reminds me and ourselves, that we can sit here and say, regenerative management practices create a more sustainable system, a more enduringly successful farming operation, creates more nutrient-dense foods for the population. All of that we believe strongly and are supportive of, but the execution rests on a small number of people, and those are the ones that are thinking about the weather risk that they have no control about. They're thinking about the crop insurance payment that's coming due. They're thinking about the impact on commodity prices caused by all of these global macro events that you and I spoke about last time we had the pleasure of speaking. And so we don't see a magic bullet, but we do see the importance of understanding that structure, which relies upon just that small cohort of our system, right? The primary producers, the stewards of the land, and appreciating the risk that they undertake as they do that transition. So if you'll allow me to geek out a little bit as an investor, we believe our role in how we approach the underwriting. So the lens we look at when investing into key participants in the food system is, and love that phrase you used of the carbon tunnel, which we hope very shortly it'll be, hey, 2022's calling, they want their very narrow focus back, right? It is each of these items within the biodiversity, which in the system bring risks. So from an underwriting perspective, it's incumbent upon FCC Capital to look and say, understand that you may be thinking of carbon sequestration as a revenue source. But we are thinking about soil health as a risk. We are thinking about water usage as a risk. We are thinking about access to energy as a risk. Right? When we think about deploying capital, doesn't matter actually on which side of the farm gate. We are constantly thinking about water, waste, energy, labor, things that regenerative management practices, as we all know, mitigate the downsides on. But to bring it back to the question, at Farm Credit Canada, we believe that by asking these questions and requiring not just that carbon tunnel perspective, but asking through the risks and the opportunities. But again, from an investment perspective, the risks is what opens up that mindset and opens up the conversation, both from the primary producers to the capital. I'll come back to two things that, again, I believe you and I have talked about before, and we've touched upon even in this conversation. But number one is progress over perfection. In my prior lives and at Farm Credit Canada, we are incredibly mindful that we must keep moving forward. We must keep moving forward as we think about food sovereignty, as we think about access to food, food security, which means many different things to many different people. When we think about the natural evolution to sustainable management practices, regenerative management practices, sometimes at Farm Credit Canada, we find ourselves sitting there with that whiteboard and holding ourselves to a standard that is perfection. And that's not how humans should be holding themselves to. That's not how systems operate. And that's certainly not how our stewards of the land, our primary producers, would be sitting on their soil saying perfection. Like, we simply want to keep moving forward. So progress over perfection. And then something that I just mentioned is we remind ourselves on a daily basis that our mandate is anchored with our primary producers, because it's all about the soil. It's all about the ranchers and our farmers that are stewarding the land and stewarding our animals towards these inputs into the food and ag system. And so, whenever we talk to really interesting innovators and technologists and climate scientists, we feel privileged that we can always bring the perspective of our customers and our industry stewards of the land. And so it's those two things, progress over perfection. And I know the RFSI folks and those that will be joining together in Winnipeg always know this, but just reminding ourselves about the primary producers, about the ranchers that are there, really at the tip of this system that's so incredibly important to humanity.